How's it going, guys? Preston or Citizen Response. Today we're going to discuss the topic whether or not you should have a light trigger in your concealed carry gun. Today we're going to be discussing the topic whether or not you should put a modified lighter trigger in your concealed carry gun. Now this video is going to be broken down into 3 parts. The first part is rebutting some of the legacy arguments against having a lighter trigger in your carry gun. Then we're going to talk about some of the benefits that you get from having a lighter, crisper trigger in your carry gun. And then we're going to finally discuss some training and carry considerations when doing so. The legacy arguments against a lighter trigger in your concealed carry gun typically come down to a few different things. The first is a concern with negligence, the second is a concern with safety, and the third is a concern with legality. So we're going to go through a lot of the major ones that we've seen over the last decade or so and discuss each one in length. The first thing to understand, a lot of these arguments are coming from people who run larger scale training courses. And so what that means for them is ultimately their number one concern, their number one bottom line is liability. They're trying to stay in business. They're trying to continue running students through their courses and making money. So that is the ultimate bottom line, is making sure that whatever practices they are putting in have to first pass their liability test. So if they cannot vet every single student and their skill level coming through their class, they probably don't want someone with a lighter trigger showing up to a concealed carry class where they're going to be drawing from appendix, clearing malfunctions, things of the such, since they have not had the time to be able to vet their skill and safety utilizing said platform. So first thing, you gotta just understand the perspective of where some of these arguments are coming from. Alongside this, most of these arguments against lighter triggers come at the lowest common denominator shooter. So for the mass majority of people consuming media and the content in the gun space are lower to novice level shooters. So yes, it actually may not be a good idea for a newer shooter, a newer concealed carrier to run a lighter trigger in their gun. However, that doesn't necessarily apply to higher level shooters, people who have been training consistently for years and years, where they may get a large benefit from it. So the meat and potatoes of the main argument against a lighter trigger, based on most of the videos that I've seen, comes down to safety and when you are deciding to make a shot in that life or death situation. So the first one we're going to talk about is making the shot. The argument typically goes, well, if I'm on target and I start pressing out the slack in my trigger and I decide not to shoot, or the person doing the thing causing me to have to shoot in the first place stops doing it, it gives me time to let off the trigger. Now, this fundamentally violates one of the main rules of gun safety, which is don't even put your finger on the trigger until you've already made the decision to shoot. I fall into this line of thinking even when I had a striker fired gun with a heavier trigger. I'm not prepping and pressing that trigger until I have made a 100% distinction that I have decided that that thing needs to be shot. Whatever it is, it's an animal, a person doing something. I'm not prepping and pressing the trigger until that is 100% dedicated that yes, it needs to be shot. So I don't even know what else I need to rebut with that. That's just a terrible training philosophy and very illegal, honestly, at the same time. We have countless videos and body cams of officers. I'm not judging them or blaming them, but they have their finger on the trigger when holding a suspect at gunpoint. How many times have we seen one of them accidentally let off or set off a round? And those were with Glocks with heavier triggers, some of them between 5 and 9 pounds, depending on the state. So that argument to me is completely null and void. Your finger should stay off the trigger until you are ready to shoot. The second argument is that it makes the guns less drop safe. While this can be applied and it is true with certain guns, it is not true with all guns. For example, the Smith & Wesson M&P Apex trigger has been vetted and tested ad nauseum and is an example of a good light trigger you can put in a quality, reliable gun that is 100% safe. This is the Ram Tactical trigger that I use in my P365. While this doesn't have nearly the service life or testing that something like the Apex does, I've conducted my own testing, thousands of rounds through this thing, dropped it many times. I have a whole video on that, and it has proved to be reliable and safe. Where it is true is something like the Ghost connector and a Glock. I have seen those fire when you pull the trigger and also fire you when you release the trigger, multiple times in multiple different guns. So that, I think, is where that argument of safety comes from, is people trying to modify Glock triggers, which don't really do well modified when compared to some other platforms. The final argument that comes from these legacy instructors, legacy trainers, is that when you are in combat stress, that trigger is going to feel much lighter than it actually is. While I cannot personally vet this, as I have never been in combat, you see SF guys are using Geissele triggers in their rifles, And many police officers across this country for the last 50 years have been using 1911s on duty and have gotten into good shoots with them if properly trained. So I think that's more of a training issue and familiarity with your gun and understanding the consequences, positive and negative, of running a lighter trigger. I think that can be overcome with training. The final legacy argument against having a lighter trigger usually came down to liability and some overzealous DA coming after you for having a modified gun. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I can't give you legal advice, but if I'm in the situation where I have to use this thing to protect my life or the life of my loved ones or some innocent third party, that's an afterthought to me. I want the absolute best tool that I can use. And it's also state to state dependent. In Texas here, for example, if you are justified to use lethal force, you can use whatever. Legally, it can be a brick, it can be an axe, it can be a gun. It doesn't matter if it's modified or unmodified. If you need to use it and you are justified in using lethal force, it doesn't really matter. But like I said, I'm not an attorney, so if you want further information or you want to vet some of the information I'm giving you, I would highly recommend reaching out to a Second Amendment or some kind of, maybe even your local DA, and give them a call, give them a chat, and see what they say about this topic. Now that we've rebutted some of the arguments against a light trigger, now let's talk about what are some of the benefits that you get with a lighter, crisper trigger in your carry gun. The main overarching reason for putting one of these in your carry gun is you have a much higher discernible level of input into the gun. I have more connection to the trigger and the trigger mechanism, and I know at a much higher level when I know exactly when that gun's gonna go off. And it takes much less input to get to that point. So if I'm having to make a razor sharp shot at a farther distance, I'm going to be significantly more consistent when I'm running something like this. This Ram Tactical trigger runs about 3 pounds. When we talk about light triggers and pistols, we're talking about anywhere from 2 to 4 pounds. Your typical duty gun is going to have somewhere from a 5 to 8 pound trigger pull for a striker fired gun. Obviously your double action, single action, your double action pull is going to be much heavier on something like a SIG 226. But there's definitely a lot of performance benefit when you start running a crisper trigger and you train with it. Your ability to shoot distance more consistently and more quickly will go up exponentially with training when you are using a lighter trigger. Assuming you are doing all the fundamentals of shooting correctly, my ability to come up on a farther target and put that hit exactly where I want to is going to be more consistent with this because there is less input and less chances for me to yank that gun off target while I am pulling the trigger. It also gives me the ability to make follow-up shots on distance targets faster. So I'll make a whole video about this. I don't ride the reset and wait for it to click. When I'm shooting, I come fully off the trigger and I come right back to where I want to and I pull the trigger. I find that it is much more consistent for me to come off that trigger and get the next shot off much quicker when I'm on the timer, when I have my crisper trigger versus something like, my Glock 17, for example, where I have to put more input into that trigger as I'm making a farther distance or more lower precision shot on a target. I work church security, volunteer, and one thing that I think in my mind as I'm sitting there game planning, war gaming things out of my head, I'm glad that I have a lighter, crisper trigger because I've trained ad nauseum with this thing, and your margin for error in a situation like that is razor thin. You have to be able to put those shots exactly where you want them to go because even the most minor of deviation could result in you throwing a round into the crowd. And that is a very heavy thing that if you are in a position like that should be weighing on you very heavily. So for me, I feel much more confident in my skills and abilities in my training when I'm carrying this gun versus something else. Let's talk about some training and carry considerations when you're using a lighter trigger. The first one is if you have trained to start prepping the trigger on something like your Glock or your SIG as you're coming up from your draw, whether it be appendix or 3 o'clock, I would highly recommend you stop training to prep the trigger on the way up. This is something that has been taught and has been trained because of your typical striker fired gun has a lot of pre-travel where you come to a wall and then you have some over travel before the sear actually drops and the gun goes off. So it allows you to cheat a little bit by prepping that out. So by the time you are up at full presentation, you're able to squeeze that shot off. That is something that is going to cause a negligent discharge very quickly, especially if you are using something like this. If I started prepping, I would be able to shoot that trigger as I'm, right here kind of at this 3 position. So it's just something to consider. Whether or not you're carrying one of these, I'd probably recommend not training that just to make sure that we're following our firearm safety rules and we are being responsible as we present up onto target. you need to have a heightened awareness when you're doing any manipulations, especially with a lighter trigger, because your margin for error is significantly less. If you're up on target and you get your click and you tap rack, if your finger is even just hanging around here, you know, on a gun with more slack and a heavier trigger, you do have a little bit more margin of error if your trigger finger happens to slip and fall into this trigger well, and you're not going to send a round downrange, or hopefully it's not happening in a real situation. This is another video. I've already talked about this at length, that issue specifically, but something to consider during your reloads, during your malfunction clearance, during your reholstering. You need to have a much higher awareness of the placement of your trigger finger when you're doing those things. When you are carrying the gun, when you are reholstering the gun, you need to have a consideration. Does my holster truly fully cover this trigger? Are my clothes dangling or hanging inside of my holster as I'm starting to put the gun in? Your margin for error and your chance of having an accident go up a lot when you have a gun like this, because it takes so little input to make that thing go off. So if you're still getting used to this and you're not highly confident and highly safe and consistent in your firearms handling, you really should probably avoid this. But if you are all of those things, you may see a lot of benefit from having something like this. Off-body carry. If you are routinely carrying off-body, and what I mean by off-body is in a bag, a fanny pack, or something like that, I would advise not carrying one of these guns with a lighter trigger in the case that something happens and that gun comes out of, I'm assuming you have a holster in there. Obviously, you should be having a holster in the bag if you have it, or at least a trigger guard holster if you were having one in the pipe in the bag. Now, if you don't have one in the chamber and it's sitting in the bag, this is a moot point. But if you do, maybe stick with something with a little bit more trigger press, little heavier trigger pull. So in the case that that gun somehow gets jostled out of the holster that you have it in, your chances of having that gun go off when you have some kind of impact or input into it is significantly lower. So off-body carry, wouldn't recommend something like this. As always, at the end of my videos, I like to give an offer. I'll send you a free chronological Bible. It reorganizes, doesn't add or take anything out, but it gives you the ability to read the Bible in a format that's going to be much more palatable, allow you to really soak in what God's word is saying, whether you're a Christian or any other religion, not a believer at all. Just give it a read. Take me up on my offer. I'll send it to you totally free of charge. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching the video. Get out there, train hard, stay safe.